On one side, we have the strongest smartphone in history, the iPhone 16 Pro Max. On the other side, we have the strongest smartphone of today, the S25 Ultra. Now, of course, if you ask Samsung or Apple, I'm sure they'd both say, nah, I'd win. But seriously, guys, if you know that reference, you know it. The point is that I want to make a simplified video kind of outlining the benefits of either phone, where one might excel over the other or have a clear advantage based on my day-to-day experience, and not get too technical with this video either, because I've already made detailed reviews on both these phones and there's thousands of other reviews in general, so feel free to check those out. But again, to give you guys an honest idea of which one is right for you, so let's get into it. Let's start with the most subjective part of this review, which would be, I guess, design philosophy and language. I'll be honest, both Samsung and Apple have been extremely boring because they've pretty much been spamming the same design language for the past several generations. I mean, 16 Pro Max continues to be a heavily upgraded iPhone 12 Pro, and honestly, it still looks very similar to the original, so there's just not much to say here. The S25 Ultra does feel slightly more refreshing in comparison. The new boxy design does feel nice, but let's be honest, it's still pretty much using the same design philosophy as the S21 Ultra and every successor afterwards. Now, nonetheless, I do think that while these designs are extremely boring and repetitive at this point, they are well made. I mean, both these phones feel premium. They definitely have that flagship level build quality, though I will say that the iPhone 16 Pro Max still edges out as a slightly better built phone, especially when you look at the camera rings, for example. But again, this is going to be very subjective and I just can't put a clear winner here. It's going to come down to your own personal preference. I do want to quickly mention that if you want a stylus with your phone, you are going to inevitably have to go with the S25 Ultra, as the iPhone series as a whole does not support styluses, though I will admit that the stylus or the S Pen on the S25 Ultra is a downgrade compared to previous generations with the lack of Bluetooth connectivity. In the display category, I do believe one phone does have an advantage over the other, so let's start with the basics. Both phones have a OLED panel that looks absolutely stunning. Thanks to thinner bezels than ever before, we have a 6.9-inch wide display on both phones. Furthermore, while both phones do have a stunning resolution, the S25 Ultra has a higher resolution, which means you get a 498 ppi or pixel density rating versus the 458 ppi you get on the 16 Pro Max, which ultimately means that images and just the visual appeal of the phone is more crisp on the S25 Ultra. Furthermore, the S25 Ultra does have a slightly brighter display under peak brightness settings. However, that difference has been very marginal. Where I believe the S25 Ultra has a clear advantage is the anti-glare coating, which honestly is vastly better than what I've seen on any other smartphone screen, to the point where you end up having to keep less brightness on display just because there's less glare to begin with. So clearly, I do believe the S25 Ultra does have a better display overall. On paper, the S25 Ultra is technically the more superior phone when it comes to performance. I mean, the Snapdragon 8 Elite chip has higher scores in a lot of aspects when compared to the A18 Pro, especially in multi-core use cases as well as GPU cases as well. But when you translate that into real-world performance, the fact is that both these phones are so ridiculously fast already, it's not going to make a dramatic difference in general use cases. In fact, I still find games like Diablo Immortal, for example, are more optimized to use the hardware on the iPhone 16 Pro Max better, despite the S25 Ultra having more RAM and more GPU horsepower, to the point where you just get a more smoother experience. And again, it just shows you that hardware optimization is a bigger factor than ever before because of how powerful these chips already are, and you kind of have laws of diminishing return in that aspect. So I will say the iPhone, despite technically weaker processing power, still just marginally edges out compared to the S25 Ultra in real-world performance. In terms of the camera comparison, I'm not going to go into too much detail because there's 1,000+ videos out on it already. What I will say is that while the S25 Ultra does have a higher megapixel count for most of their lenses on paper, the iPhone manages to actually produce a very similar image quality, and in fact, in some cases, I find the iPhone has more clarity, especially with the background versus what Samsung produces with the S25 Ultra. The difference is marginal, but noticeable if you do a pixel by pixel comparison. Also, Samsung's pictures tend to have a more exaggerated color tone, which a lot of people like, versus iPhone's slightly warmer and more natural color tone. Again, that's going to be more subjective. What I will say is that the S25 Ultra does does have some extended functionality like being able to record in 8K versus just the 4K on the 16 Pro Max, and also the fact that you have that crazy impressive 100 times zoom, which is honestly so well implemented. But again, I think image quality still slightly edges out with the iPhone 16 Pro Max, while functionality edges out with the S25 Ultra. So this one is ultimately going to be a toss-up based on your personal needs and of course subjectivity. In terms of basic software usage, One UI 7 versus iOS 18.3 has never been closer. I mean, Samsung's One UI 7 is so clean and consistent that honestly, in some areas it gives iOS a run for its money. It is a breath of fresh air, and it really shows all the refinement Samsung's done over the years to get over here. Now with that said, both OSs do clearly have their shining points. For example, Spotlight search on iOS is so consistent and well integrated. It's still my favorite search on any smartphone out there. However, I have to admit that having human search functionality on the settings app is so good on Samsung's part. It means I no longer need to know exactly what the name of the setting is that I'm trying to find, whereas on iOS, the settings app, in my honest opinion, can be quite difficult to navigate if you don't know where you're going. In the world of AI, the S25 Ultra clearly wins. Honestly, guys, I mean simple features like AI Select, given how intuitive they are, you can select anything on your display and get correct information at a moment's notice, versus Apple Intelligence, which still feels kind of sticky and inconsistent with the information it gives you on display. Or take Photo Assist, for example. With the Samsung S25 Ultra, you can select any object and usually it gets it right perfectly, and then you can use generative AI to remove that object and it looks candid and natural, almost like it would be a Photoshop job. On Apple Intelligence within the Photos app, not only does it struggle to find the object because it's not as contextually aware, when you do use generative AI to kind of fill or remove an object, it's an awful job 9 out of 10 times. And this is not something I've noticed, something that pretty much every reviewer out there has noticed. Apple Intelligence just feels unpolished and honestly incomplete when compared to what Samsung's done with the S25 Ultra. I'm also not the biggest fan of Siri. I still feel like it lags behind the likes of Google's Gemini, which honestly just has a bigger database to work with and objectively does better when using geographic search results with a number of criterias. Though again, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of voice assistants altogether and don't actually use them nearly as much. In terms of battery life, the iPhone 16 Pro Max is simply a more efficient phone. Despite having a smaller battery capacity, it still managed to give me 9.5 hours of real-world runtime versus approximately 9 hours with the S25 Ultra, despite having a larger 5,000 milliamp hour battery. And then it's also worth noting that the S25 Ultra does not have true Qi 2 wireless charging because of magnetic alignment, whereas the iPhone 16 Pro Max gives you that with the native body. Though it is worth noting, of course, that the S25 Ultra does have faster wired charging to compensate for that. So pick your potato, I guess, but ultimately I do think the iPhone is the winner in terms of battery life. Pricing is a very subjective game because despite being more expensive, the S25 Ultra will ultimately usually end up being cheaper for you, the consumer. So let me explain. Look, here in North America, the iPhone 16 Pro Max has a starting price point of $1,200 for the base 256GB capacity. The S25 Ultra starts at $1,300 for the same capacity. However, unlike the iPhone 16 Pro Max, the S25 Ultra frequently goes on sale. You'll often find it $100, $200 off. It has better trade-in values, and most of the people that actually get it, especially outside North America, actually end up paying less for Samsung Ultra phones than they do for iPhone's Pro Series phones. So even though, again, it's more expensive on paper, you usually end up getting the S25 Ultra a little bit cheaper. While ultimately these both are some pretty fantastic phones, they're also really expensive. And my honest thoughts are that neither of these phones really are worth it if you have even a 2-generation old phone. These prices are ridiculous. In some parts of the world, you're paying like exuberant amount of money for these flagship level phones, which is probably why they're not selling as well as their mid-range counterparts. But despite that, if I had to pick one right now, I would say the S25 Ultra does slightly edge out in terms of value. It's got a better display. It does give you the bonus stylus functionality if you want it. If you don't, it's still fine. You also do have other added benefits like the 100 times zoom or the ability to record in 8K. And then of course you have a far more polished AI system. Apple Intelligence is honestly a failure at the time of this video. I hope it gets better, but it just feels, pale in comparison to what Samsung's currently offering with their AI systems. And I'm a bigger fan of Google's Gemini. Ironically, iOS and iPhone is still my daily driver at the time of this video, but I still do think the S25 Ultra is the better phone if I had to pick one with a unbiased approach. Let me know what you think of about these phones, which one you think is better, which one you think ultimately wins. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to this channel, liking this video. Catch you in the next one.